Good evening. Welcome to today's webinar, A New President, Navigating Canada-U.S. Relations Post-Elections 2024. I'm Andrew Erskine, Research Fellow at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. IPD is a Canadian nonpartisan think tank dedicated to promoting ideas that support diplomacy, constructive engagement, and prudent realism in international affairs. It remains a toss-up whether Kamala Harris or Donald Trump becomes the next U.S. president. Both candidates have shifted nearly all their focus to battleground states, where polls indicate a back-and-forth race, with both candidates gaining a razor-thin advantage in some key states. If former President Donald Trump retakes the presidency, systemic changes lay ahead. Trump and his MAGA supporters are honing a domineering agenda to assert their will regarding America's interests. A second Trump presidency, with near total control over the GOP caucus, party apparatus, and voter base, will enable a series of populist and ultranationalist policies around trade, immigration, innovation, and defense to be rolled out at a blistering pace, both in Congress and via executive orders. A more professionalized Trump administration would likely upend America's relationship with allies, partners, and rivals, reshaping geopolitics and global trade in America's favor, possibly for a generation to come, and as well cement the president's legacy in what would presumably be his final presidential term. Meanwhile, Vice President Kamala Harris has vowed to maintain and enhance many of the Biden administration's protectionist policies, including commitments to invest more in U.S. energy production and industrial sectors to support innovation powered by American workers, as well as plans to create a national stockpile of critical minerals to assist in its competition with China in semiconductors, biotechnology, aerospace, and auto industries. Although Harris is proclaiming an America-forward presidency, her pitch to the American people appears to similarly advance an America-first policy in economic and technological sectors, simply with more transparency and less impulsiveness. In contrast to Trump, Harris also emphasizes strengthening alliances by prioritizing collaborative security frameworks and partnerships with like-minded allies. Her approach includes bolstering NATO commitments, expanding cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, and promoting democratic resilience against authoritarian influence. With such heightened attention on the U.S. election, Canada is undergoing a process to navigate their policy priorities with that of an impending Trump or Harris presidency. With each presidential candidate holding their own unique opinions and perspectives on key events that are going on in the world, like the ongoing wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, but also on China, Arctic security, and NATO, how might their presidencies affect bilateral relations with Canada? What are the opportunities and challenges emerging from both presidential outcomes? To assist in this discussion, IPD has assembled an outstanding dais of speakers. First, we have Zachary Pakin. Zach is a senior fellow at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, the deputy director of the Better Order Project, and a research fellow in the Grand Strategy Program at Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft in Washington, D.C. He holds a PhD in international relations from the University of Kent in Canterbury, UK, and his research focuses on Russian foreign policy, European security, great power relations, and international order. Andrew Latham, a professor of international relations and political theory from Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota, is also a senior Washington fellow, with the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, and a regular opinion contributor to both the Hill newspaper in Washington and Real Clear Defense. Last and certainly not least, we have Christopher Sands. Chris directs the Canada Institute at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, home to the largest research program of Canada and U.S.-Canadian relations outside of Canada. He is also the director of the Hopkins Center for Canadian Studies at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, which is the only academic research center dedicated to Canada in the nation's capital and the Mid-Atlantic region. Although he is often mistaken for a Canadian, he was born and raised in Detroit, Michigan. Gentlemen, welcome. Before we commence, I would like to let the audience watching know that the chat board will be monitored and that you can write your questions there. We will also make time for a Q&A session for the panelists to answer any questions. With that said, let's get into discussion. We share common values from the past, a common defense line at present, and common aspirations for the future, and indeed, the future of all mankind. Geography has made us neighbors, history has made us friends, economics has made us partners, and necessity has made us allies. Those whom nature hath so joined together that no man put us under. What unites us is far greater than what divides us. This excerpt from President John F. Kennedy's speech to Parliament from 1961 underscores the depth of the Canada-U.S. relationship, describing it as a partnership in every sense of the word. This speech is also a classic demonstration of the special relationship concept, framed by the mutual respect, shared interests, and close geographical, economic, and cultural ties. And it's a great launching point for our first question. For a long time, Canada has viewed its relationship with the United States as special, particularly in cooperating and collaborating in areas like trade, defense, and diplomacy. Where does this sense of uniqueness come from? How has and how does the United States view its relationship with Canada? Is our relationship with Washington still special? And what steps can Canada take to foster a more stable and predictable footing with the United States while acknowledging possible fluctuations? Christopher, I would really enjoy to hear your thoughts on the first question.
Oh gosh. All right. Well, thank you very much, and thanks to the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy for having me on. Um, I think part of the problem here is the international domestic divide. In a lot of ways, Americans see Canadians as the neighbors. So our relationship includes traditional diplomatic elements. Obviously, defense relationship, a diplomatic relationship, cooperation abroad, and a trade relationship run through our Office of the United States Trade Representative and Department of Commerce. But increasingly, the relationships sort of fabric is woven by the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Energy, it might be the Department of Transportation, or the Department of Homeland Security. Many of the domestic policy agencies in the United States are now in direct contact with Canadian counterparts. And because of our deep economic integration, it's often difficult for the US to achieve its goals, whether it's on public health, trying to squash COVID, or trying to transition to a sustainable economy. It's almost impossible for us to do that without some level of Canadian cooperation, collaboration, etc. And because our trade agreements specifically refused to delegate sovereignty, we have no one to turn to. The option always comes down to what extent can we communicate, collaborate, and cooperate. And that puts a lot of emphasis on our federal governments. And it makes Canada-U.S. relations a kind of unique set of relationships for the U.S. abroad, in that they're both very dense and very decentralized. Reg Stewart, author out in at Mount St. Mary's University, once said that it was a dispersed relationship. So it's sort of scattered about. And the US doesn't often think about it in a strategic way. This is a relationship that's always prone to a certain amount of tactical maneuvering. If I could just sort of wrap this up with one additional comment. I'm increasingly concerned with the structures that we have for managing the relationship, which were mostly designed during the first half of the 20th century, and which I think have now been exceeded in terms of their capacity to manage the actual issues that we have together. A lot of our relationship is disintermediated because we share media and social media. And so I think this is mainly pointing the finger at the United States. The US has to modernize its approach to the conduct of its relationship with Canada. It needs new tools, it needs new thinking, and it needs to be a bit more coherent. Even though I think Americans generally like Canada and respect Canada, when it comes down to it, the structures that we have are out of date, and we could be a better partner than we are. And that's irrespective of who wins a presidential election or who runs the Congress.
Thank you, Christopher. Andrew, we'll pivot to you now, and I'm interested to see if if you can build upon any of Christopher's points, or if you have anything different. As Chris kind of indicated in the last little bit of his opening, I think speaking from a Canadian standpoint, we really do see our relations with the United States unfold in three particular areas, with institutionally, structurally, and within the policy governmental kind of aspect lens. So I'm interested to get your kind of perspective on this. Sorry, Andrew, you were just on mute.
My perspective is this: for a couple of decades now, I think it has been a conceit amongst Canadians that they have some special relationship with the United States. Yes, we're friends. We're not going to go to war with each other. Nothing like that. But the idea that Washington listens to Ottawa more than it listens to other capitals, maybe once upon a time. Maybe once upon a time when Canada had a meaningful middle power status in institutions, global institutions, but that era is long past. And I don't think Washington pays very much attention, except in this respect. And this gets kind of maybe ahead of the conversation a little bit, but in terms of the upcoming election, irrespective of who wins the presidency, if Canada doesn't pull its weight, Canada's going to suffer some consequences. Whether that's 2% in terms of NATO defense spending in the NATO context, or whether it's some participation in the Indo-Pacific or the submarines or whatever. But the expectation will be there that Canada needs to pull its weight, and Canada's not going to get cut any slack, certainly not by a Trump administration, but I don't think by a Harris administration either. So we have been eating through, we Canadians have been eating through our capital, our political capital in Washington for a long time now. And I think it's just about done. And so I think we need to, what's the term I'm looking for? Pony up and start delivering in ways that we simply haven't for a long time.
Thank you, Andrew. Zach, we'll head to you now, and obviously we've had two interesting introductions to this topic, and I think what we see here in Canada, we see the government, particularly Liberal government, gathering up and beginning their Team Canada approach to their relations with the United States, but then you also see provincial governments as well, kind of taking in the seriousness of this election and trying their best to hone in their regional presence and their regional discourses and dialogues with their American counterparts. So again, I'd really like to have your opinion on, is there anything Canada can do, whether it's from a federal standpoint, or through a whole of government or whole society approach to creating a more stable and predictable footing with the United States that either builds upon this this previous concept of a special relationship, or as Andrew kind of indicated, maybe build towards something that's new and updated, that's more pragmatic for the policies and the direction of the country to come.
Well, thanks very much, Andrew, for putting this panel together, and really a pleasure always to see both Andrew and Chris. Thanks both of you as well for wearing your poppies. I'll have to try to get my hands on one here in Geneva and head over to the Canadian mission at some point in the coming days. Let me just, to answer your question, Andrew, let me step back for a second and address the broader theme that you brought up about a special relationship, which is, I agree, something that has become deeply ingrained in the minds of many Canadians because of our longstanding history together. And you referenced some of it in that excerpt from JFK's speech to the Canadian Parliament. We stabilized a war-plagued continent together in the late 19th century. We built the world's longest undefended border. We have this notion, challenged, of course, recently by the shift in political culture in the United States to some extent, but this notion that we are basically, the same people and nations of immigrants with same national histories, national stories. From the first Quebec conference to the beaches of Normandy, we liberated Europe together. After World War II, Canada played a significant role in ensuring that the United States remained involved in the international order through NATO, distinguishing the U.S. role in the international order from that which prevailed during the interwar period. And then, of course, subsequently, in subsequent decades, we eventually built, what turned out to be the world's single largest bilateral economic relationship, and a special diplomatic relationship as well, particularly under the years of Brian Mulroney, under not just one, but two U.S. presidents. And that's all hugely significant. And we're still living in the shadow of all of that. That's part of our living memory even today. But it's also, 3 or 4 decades ago at this point. And a lot has happened in the world since then that Canadians need to think about if they want to think about ways of how to stabilize the relationship with a United States that is increasingly subject to centrifugal, impersonal political forces that transcend whoever sits in the White House. And I'd say that, at least a couple, maybe even 3 things, that I'll list, at least for now, that are significant, that have helped to unravel this notion of a special relationship between Canada and the United States. One simply is the rise of the rest. The rest of the world, in particular, the global South, China, have risen economically. They've become more important strategically. And the inevitable consequence of this is that the G7 is less able to dictate the terms of the international order, which in relative terms means that just Canada is going to be less important than it was before. There are other markets that are more important now than just the Western markets. There are other powers that are more strategically relevant than simply Western powers. And all of that by default is going to make Canada in relative terms less strategically significant to the United States. But it goes beyond that because that's something that's been underway for a few decades already. If you look just at the past decade or so, you've seen the return of great power competition, the return of contested regional orders to both the Euro-Atlantic space and what is now increasingly being labeled, perhaps controversially, the Indo-Pacific space. And in both cases, the United States needs to focus on developing partnerships with serious middle powers in those two theaters. And Canada is not one of those things. It is not as important to the European order as a term setter as Germany is, or France is, or Britain is, or even Poland. And look, it's certainly far, far behind in the Asian context, and nowhere near as important to setting the terms of regional order in Asia as Australia, or Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, Vietnam, others. So this leaves us in a situation where, at least in comparison with our other so-called Anglo-Saxon, I hesitate to call Canada a purely Anglo-Saxon country, but Australia is more relevant strategically to the United States than Canada is. And in fact, Australia is more strategically present in the United States, in Washington, D.C., in strategic circles in Washington than Canada is. I think that there's a greater awareness in Washington among government circles and think tankers of what Australia's strategic interests are than what Canada's strategic interests are. Australia communicates that very well. In Canada, not only do we not communicate them, I don't even know if we really know what they are. All of that makes geography more important. The return of great power competition makes geography more important. It makes actors in those regions more relevant than Canada, which militates against this dynamic that you had during the Cold War, where Canada was a much more important partner for the United States. And then the last thing is simply the decline of Canada's diplomacy now that we've seen under consecutive prime ministers. It's a multi-partisan issue. It's not a liberal issue or a conservative issue. I wish that more people in Ottawa would wake up to the fact that this is not a partisan issue. There's no simply changing the government and saying that Canada is back. This is a long-term decline that we're facing right now. And we've seen simultaneous to all of this, an increasingly ideologically driven, increasingly loudspeaker driven, increasingly reactive Canadian foreign policy, which has only served to make us more dependent on the United States in strategic terms, which makes us less useful to the United States in strategic terms. And it makes us less useful to American adversaries as well in strategic terms. So it's a lose-lose, really. Putting all of that together, I think we need to take account of the ways in which the world has changed, in which Canadian foreign policy has failed to keep up with those changes. And rather than try to reverse all of that and rebuild this special relationship, we have to acknowledge that it's gone, that the factors that once sustained it no longer exist. And that's okay. I think we need to wake up to the fact that that's okay. We can acknowledge that that's okay. It doesn't mean that we're less than. Maybe a lot of Canadians will think that means that we're less than because we're constantly, striving and struggling to get America's attention, and that's what gives us our sense of self-worth. But we shouldn't think that way anymore. What we need to focus on is defining and communicating very clearly our national interests, limited though they may be, to an American audience, and taking it from there. But that is a multi-partisan initiative from Canada's part, and it is a long-term initiative from Canada's part. It requires, by definition, parties to work together because governments change every so often.
Exactly. And I think your last point is a great segue into our second question. I think obviously, as you said, the special relationship has ceased to exist now for many years. And as you brilliantly put it, it is a multi-partisan issue. And especially when Justin Trudeau obviously was elected in 2015, he did had this break promotion that he said Canada was back, and then following soon after, Donald Trump came, and early on in his administration, Donald Trump dealt with a challenging Congress in terms of not having full support and some administrative what he would call disunity. But then I know from my perspective, whenever President Biden got in, you kind of again had that Canadian exhale of breath going, okay, we can go back to normal. But as you said, America has moved on, has recognized its new geopolitical positions, whether it's in the Pacific, whether it's within the North American context or in Europe. So, we're here in Canada, the politicians and government officials are beginning to look at, well, what would a Trump 2.0 or Harris presidency, expect from Canada. And so I want to shift our attention now, and if you can put your, American political strategic hat on and see, if you can try and help the audience understand, what would a Trump, or Harris administration look like when it concerns to either the United States approach to great power competition with China. In particular, should Canada align closely with the United States strategies in this rivalry, or are there any areas where a distinct Canadian approach towards China or to other geopolitical issues in the Indo-Pacific would serve our interests and values much better? And then another area that we're really interested in kind of highlighting and getting at is shifts in U.S. support and approaches towards NATO. How should Canada navigate a Trump or Harris perception to safeguarding its security interests, in the transatlantic, along with its commitments along NATO lines? What strategies could Canada consider to maintain NATO's cohesion, where you keep America in, obviously, but also make it resilient to any kind of pushes against growing isolationism within the American political system? And then lastly, here in Canada, it's an issue that before hasn't been really addressed, but now that we're seeing it being indicated more prevalent in elections and in debates and in campaign slogans, is cross-border security challenges for the Canada-U.S. border, particularly when it comes to curbing criminal network, drug trafficking and smuggling operations along shared borders. Is there an expectation from the United States, whether it's a Trump or Harris, that this issue now will be one of the forefronts of of North American politics going forward? Zach, we'll start with you.
Sure. So a lot to unpack there. Let me maybe just take a few of those questions. So, I think you asked the question of, basically, what does the United States expect of us, and how do we sort of align our own interests with theirs to some extent? I think to some extent that's the wrong question. And just to go back to what I was saying before, it's not what they expect of us that needs to be driving our policy exclusively. It's also what our interests are, and can we communicate those to the Americans? We've seen Canadian leaders at times, try to basically express our national interests in a way that clearly communicates that they're aligned with those of the United States, even when, objectively, to go back to the features that drive national interests that I was suggesting before, geography, the balance of power, by definition, countries are not going to have the same interests in situations like that at all times. And so just to illustrate maybe some of the ways in which there are some differences, I mean, in Asia, I think that is one case where our interests are not necessarily 100% aligned, in part because Canada has very little to contribute in the military and security sphere. We've carved out in our national Indo-Pacific strategy a regional neighborhood role for ourselves in the North Pacific. I think that's fine, that's warranted. But I don't see much utility in Canada prioritizing, for example, sailing through the Taiwan Strait and adding to deterrence with China, because we don't add anything tangible to deterrence in that front. We are not a significant security player in the region, across this vast theater known as the Indo-Pacific that presumably stretches from the Suez Canal all the way down to Tasmania and then up all the way to Alaska. So let's keep that in mind. Our interest, what is our interest? It is different to some extent from the American interest. The American interest is or at least has been declared as such, is to win a strategic competition with China and to remain number one, both in the region and in the world. If that's our interest as well, to see the United States win that strategic competition at any cost, then we should say so. But my sense is that Canada has other interests as well, besides simply wanting to see the United States win the strategic competition at any cost. Canada has an interest, as we continue to proclaim, in a rules-based international order, which a bifurcated regional economic order and increasing security competition between the United States and China threatens. So if we want one common set of rules and one integrated region so that Canada's exports and Canadian economic interests more broadly can be pursued in a reliable environment, then to some extent, and our influence here, of course, is limited, but to some extent, we should be pushing, for the continuation of, an integrated region rather than a bifurcated one. That doesn't mean that we're not going to cooperate with the United States where our interests do align. They do align on many files. When Canada's and North America's rather, economic market is concerned, we're going to have to align ourselves or coordinate, very closely with the United States. Doesn't mean that we have to adopt their policy verbatim. The European Union has not adopted, for example, American policy verbatim on, let's say, Chinese EVs, whereas Canada did. But nonetheless, we'll need to consult, we'll need to coordinate closely. But we need to distinguish issues that are relevant specifically to the security and integrity of the North American market and the homeland on the one hand, from what we want the shape of the Asian region to look like. So that's one area in which I think it would be useful for Canada not simply to try to communicate its interests in a way that is aligned with those of the United States, because the U.S. already has partners that are of use to it in that region. Our interests are not necessarily aligned. In the case of Europe, and maybe I'll finish on this front, Canada's and America's interests do align to a much more significant extent, given Canada's unique geographic position, because the High North now is a part of NATO's strategic environment, given that Sweden and Finland have joined NATO, meaning that the 7 non-Russian members of the Arctic Council are all members of the Atlantic Alliance at this point. So Canada has a unique opportunity there to contribute to the transatlantic alliance by focusing specifically on circumpolar and continental defense in partnership with NATO allies. But beyond that, there's something unique that Canada can do there as well, which is that, security in all cases, this is true across the Euro-Atlantic space, but also specifically in the High North, security is going to be a mixture of deterrence and communication, right? There needs to be strength, but there also needs to be deconfliction. And if Canada wanted to play some kind of a role in forging a deconfliction mechanism with Russia in the Arctic as some kind of a long-term goal, that would be a useful and unique Canadian contribution that maybe the United States might not be capable of doing in the context of an increasingly deep, hopefully not too deep, U.S.-Russia rivalry. So let's keep that in mind. But in all cases, this will require Canada, to go back to maybe my first answer, this will require us not prioritizing resuscitating a special relationship with the United States, right? If we are going to be able to pursue our interests effectively and independently in contexts like this, and to maintain the ties and the respect of other powers, both our allies and adversaries, in this context, to be able to forge regional orders or deconfliction mechanisms or other diplomatic ties, then this is going to require us not to be focused on looking as if we are a mere extension of the United States. Our relationship with the United States is going to be important, hugely so, but it's important that we think about it through the lens of Canada's national geostrategic interests, and not through the lens of, okay, we're just one ally among many, and defining our interests in reactive terms, rather than defining them based on first principles.
Thank you, Zach. Chris, we'll head to you now, and again, getting your perspective, being based in Washington, D.C., is the topic of Canada, either working with Trump 2.0 or Harris presidency, and in terms of, as Zach is indicated, with analyzing our strategic interests, within North America, the Indo-Pacific, the Arctic, Europe, and then elsewhere in the world, is there a need to align with U.S. policy when it comes to China, when it comes to getting a peace deal with Ukraine and supporting Ukraine in their war against Russia, as well as here in North America, in terms of creating a more integrated and strong continental economy, especially with CUSMA potentially being reviewed in 2026.
Well, thanks for the question. I think, first of all, the United States will go through this sort of rethink of its global position, whoever takes over the new administration. And in that context, what they'll be thinking about is rebalancing. The U.S. is not in this position of preponderant power that it once was. And so it has to be thoughtful about where it's going to put its emphasis, which fights it will take on and which ones it will try to hold steady, maybe kind of keep in some kind of limbo till it has time to take those on. We're in a position now, having spent a lot of money on industrial policy, having done a lot to try to support, whether it was Ukraine, Israel, others in battle, that we have to replenish our arsenals. But very bipartisan Senate Armed Services Committee last year, looking at the U.S. defense budget of about $880 billion, assessed that we should probably spend north of $1 trillion, maybe 1.2 in the next year, because great power war couldn't be ruled out in the medium term. That's a pretty serious recognition, and given our fiscal position, it means some things that are nice to have will have to get cut, and that always upsets ordinary citizens. They're prepared to prepare for war, but they also want social programs and other things that affect their daily lives, which is understandable. So in that context, the U.S. strategy will take shape, and the question of Canada won't be first on top of mind, but it will be there, because the question will be, what can we get from our allies that will help supplement the effort, that will help extend our reach, that may take up parts of that burden which are well suited to another partner. In the past, Canada has often taken on norm setting or engagement in international institutions in ways that align with American interests, also Canadian interests for that matter, particularly things like the WTO, which the World Trade Organization is the fallback if things like CUSMA or USMCA don't go well. It's not in great shape. The appellate body's in trouble. It needs some serious repair. There are a lot of questions similarly about the United Nations. Canada might choose to work within those frameworks, as it did when it launched the Ottawa process for WTO reform, which seems to have stalled, but still is nonetheless an important piece of the puzzle. And when you talk about the Indo-Pacific or the NATO sort of transatlantic relationship, I think the U.S. will look to Canada to see where it wants to put its strategic emphasis. There's always a temptation, I think, in Canada to think, maybe because you're so close to the United States, a bit like the United States. But if the U.S. can't have it all, Canada can't have it all. And so if Canada sees the Indo-Pacific, Asia-Pacific as its future, that means a serious investment in new capabilities, a shift of both focus, attention, but also diplomacy, development assistance, other things to make that a priority. And then if you do that, what will you do with your NATO commitments? Will you ever reach 2%? Will you have to step back from some of those commitments? I think those are the tough choices. And Zach quite rightly raised the question of the Arctic. That's an expensive place to operate. And the NATO Arctic, aligned against a Russian Arctic with its buddy China, also in that space, looks very differently from one end to the other. And the Canadian Arctic is probably the weakest link. It's the area where we have the worst domain awareness. We have the least ability to respond. Canada's current government has made some steps to stepping up in that area. All of this, and what I'm trying to emphasize here, is that Canada will have to make its own choices. The U.S. would like some things, probably likes other things less. But it's up to Canada as a sovereign country to decide where it wants to go. And I think then you'll see the U.S. respond as it assembles its response with all the other allies. It's not a question of, is Canada in or out? It'll be a question of, where does Canada choose to be? Where are the gaps? Who can we get to fill the gaps? And if I could put maybe one last thought for listeners and for the panel. When Secretary of State Tony Blinken came to Canada for a short visit in December of 2022. He came to set up what became President Biden's visit to Ottawa in early 2023. But when he did that, he brought two items he wanted to talk to the Canadians about. The first was taking the lead on the crisis in Haiti, and the second was asking Canada to prepare to take a leading role in post-conflict Ukraine reconstruction. Both of those seemed like good fits given Canada's past interest. But Canada said a hard no to Haiti and not very encouraging on Ukraine, worried about the costs, the burdens, and how it would shape up. Understandable, but it left Washington with, I think, a dilemma, a question. Are we dealing with a Canada that won't, or are we dealing with a Canada that can't? Because if our friends, the Canadians, won't, then we negotiate. We put some carrots out there, maybe rattle some sticks at you, hope that we can bring you along in some capacity at some level. if it's a Canada that can't, if that's where the country's at, then there's no point in humiliating you. There's no point in rubbing your nose in it. You can't. So we'll stop asking. And I know a lot of Canadians have looked at the AUKUS partnership in with Australia and the United Kingdom and the United States on submarines. They've looked at other sort of nascent alliances, the Quad in the Indo-Pacific, for example, and wondered, is there a role for Canada in that space? Well, I think it will come down to both what Canada chooses to do and whether Canada is prepared to do anything. So it will, not won't, it will, or whether it can't. And I could see a government that's axing taxes and doing all sorts of other frugal things, feeling that Canada's international role is too expensive. It's a luxury that can't be afforded right now. That'll be Canada's decision to make. I promise we won't invade or humiliate you, but I think it has strategic consequences, and that's something I haven't heard serious Ottawa politicians taking on right now, or at least not in recent years.
Thank you, Christopher. Andrew, we'll give you the last word on this question and on this section. Anything to build, anything that maybe wasn't brought up in terms of, what's going on in the Middle East, or, obviously with Ukraine, obviously, but Minister Joly and Prime Minister Trudeau had their long titled ministerial conference on the human dimension of Ukraine Peace Summit, something along those lines, yesterday and today. So, obviously Canada, as Christopher said, is trying to do foreign policy and, having an independent and autonomous foreign outlook on the cheap. So just, is there anything you can build upon?
I have so much to say. And most of it is concordant with my two friends and colleagues here. But I would layer on top of what has been said already that the most rational thing that Ottawa could do in terms of its foreign policy is to adopt, and this is a grandiose term, but to adopt a grand strategy of restraint. Canada cannot contribute anything to peace, security, and stability, or even development in the Middle East. HMCS Ottawa going through the Strait of Taiwan, completely and utterly irrelevant in terms of the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. And I could go on and on and on. Where can Canada actually make a serious contribution? Canada is not a middle power like it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. Those days are done. And it's not a middle power like Iran or Turkey or in the contemporary sense, because we're in a region which we inhabit with the United States, and they're always going to be dominant, and we're never going to be. So what can we actually do to contribute to international peace and security? Well, I would say, and both Zach and Chris have raised this already, we should invest a lot in Arctic security, building an infrastructure, updating, upgrading NORAD, for example. I think the plan, I was about to say scheme, but that sounds awkward. The plan to purchase or build or whatever 12 submarines, I think is pretty sound, actually, because it would allow the Royal Canadian Navy to help secure the North Pacific, the North Atlantic, and the Arctic. And that seems to me to be not only in Canada's best interests, but it would contribute meaningfully to continental security. Those are 12 submarines the U.S. doesn't have to deploy. Maybe some icebreakers would be nice, right? Maybe some port facilities and some airports, or even, imagine this, some roads in the Arctic, which I know is a difficult thing to do, but my point is building a security infrastructure in the Arctic in ways that bridge the North Atlantic, the Arctic, and the North Pacific would really, no matter what administration we have to endure after next Tuesday, no matter what administration, they would appreciate that. So that's one thing that I think from a restraint perspective, Canada should not be trying to play even a role in Europe anymore. Ukraine, I'm sorry, I just don't think so. If you've got limited funds, limited energy, limited political capital, invest it in the Canadian North, the North American North, and stop pretending that this is 1967 and that we are somehow players around the world, because we're not. Nobody pays any attention. We don't invest enough to make anybody pay any attention. And I guess at the end of the day, I'm just quite cold-bloodedly rational about this. We can make a big difference in terms of North Pacific, Arctic, and North Atlantic. We cannot make any difference in the world in terms of Taiwan or Ukraine or any of those places. So I guess what I'm doing, and I'll close on this note, is let's have Ottawa adopt a restraint perspective. We have X number of resources. We have things we actually can do because we know we can. Our North Strong and Free, that promissory note that was promulgated by the government of Canada recently, if you read that carefully, it's really interesting. It's very granular in the sense that it talks about, for example, developing vehicles that can actually operate efficiently in the Arctic, combat vehicles, because, you know, the Leopard tanks don't really work all that well up there. Let's take that document seriously. Let's unpack it, and then let's invest in the bits and pieces of it. That seems to me to be both a restraint and a rational and a realist approach to Canadian grand strategy. And just forever, please, if I could telegraph this to Ottawa in a way that it would be received, give up on the myth that we are a meaningful middle power, and give up on the myth that Washington actually listens to Ottawa about anything other than narrow bilateral concerns having to do with the border and things like that. That would be my advice.
Thank you, Andrew. And just building off your point, I was in Montreal the past 2 days, and Minister Jolie gave the concluding keynote address at the Montreal Climate Security Summit. And in that address, she was very proud to kind of hint and to kind of, you know, promote in kind of a semi way that she's working on an Arctic foreign policy. So you know, who knows, you may be surprised and intrigued, and maybe there will be some roads, maybe some port capabilities, as well as more development and innovation in that area. But that's something we're gonna have to wait and see, I guess. And I want to shift now towards Ottawa and kind of, you know, going off what Zachary had hinted at, which is, you know, how can Canada divulge its priorities to a Harris or Trump 2.0 presidency? You know, Ottawa has revived its so-called Team Canada approach to diplomacy with the United States, especially in the event that Donald Trump returns to the White House. But as something that all of you have kind of hinted at and highlighted, Canada faces its own problems. You know, domestically, there is still inflation. There's, you know, a crisis around housing and healthcare. We do have a poor force posture. We have insufficient military capabilities. And then if you look at what's going on within, you know, our reputation internationally, you know, it can best be summarized as withering. You know, we're being excluded from key military projects like AUKUS, like the Quad. We're having our citizens arbitrarily arrested, which is part of the Chinese hostage diplomacy. And, you know, with large-scale foreign interference that is being undertaken by China, Russia, Iran, and India, the latter of which is being investigated for operating and sanctioning assassinations against Canadian Sikhs citizens, there are competing factors here that, you know, can maybe plague Canada and how it can communicate what it wants to do and what how its interests align with the next U.S. president. So, Andrew, I'll direct this first question to you. Does there need to be one overarching strategy that transcends politics? You know, the United States does inhabit, you know, two Americas right now. There is a Republican America and there is a Democratic America. Or does Ottawa need to just strategize, you know, one strategy that showcases how its interests align with the United States on defense, on trade, and any other foreign policy positions that are crucial to our bilateral relations?
Well, it would be nice if we had one kind of rational and consistent grand strategy, and I've already articulated what I think that ought to be. But I can't actually reduce the question to a bilateral relationship with the U.S. We're in a Cold War with India. And I don't actually like the Cold War framing, capital C, capital W, but small c, small w, I'm comfortable with that. We're in a Cold War with China. But these can be handled in terms of domestic, I mean, law enforcement, intelligence, those sorts of things. I don't think that we need to think about those relationships and those challenges in terms of some kind of grand strategy, right? Again, I think, especially with respect to what's been going on recently with both China and India in Canada, those are law enforcement and intelligence issues, right? And I think they should be handled that way. In terms of our relationship with the United States more broadly, I think the restraint angle in terms of international security and foreign policy, that's important. I also think, though, that Canada needs to step up in terms of some border issues, for example, right? I think we need to be pursuing our own national interests in terms of trade. And who knows what's going to happen if there's a Trump administration. I tend to think that the guardrails are sufficiently strong that he won't get his way. And he doesn't have an ideology. He has a bunch of impulses. But one of those impulses consistently is trying to extract the maximum advantage for the United States in terms of trade relations. So he's talking about tariffs, for example. I haven't heard anybody talk about tariffs for a long time, but he's talking about tariffs. So Canada needs to play defense when it comes to those sorts of things. And I think historically we've been pretty good, not the special relationship stuff, just day-to-day diplomacy. I think we've been pretty good in terms of playing defense there. So I guess even though I opened by saying I'm in favor of a sort of coherent, rational grand strategy that touches down in with respect to various files in various specific ways, I think too, Canadian diplomats and Ottawa more generally needs to be prudent when it comes to dealing with the challenge. And frankly, I don't think a Harris administration would be all that much better. They're talking about tariffs. They're talking about all kinds of protectionist nonsense as well. Canadian diplomats, even though we no longer enjoy that special relationship, need to be in the trenches day in and day out, protecting Canadian interests. And I don't really see an alternative to that. So big picture, grand strategy, that's wonderful, fantastic. But day to day, we've got hardworking, I presume, because I know a lot of them, well-trained diplomats in the trenches or at the coalface, whatever analogy, metaphor you want, looking out for Canada's best interests. 'Twas ever thus.
Thank you, Andrew. Zach, I'll head to you now, and I kind of want to provide you with a little bit more space to maybe provide more of your opinion, your perspective on on how Canada can express its interests and how it can pursue and advance its interests, while staying in a balance with our commitments as a partner, as an ally, and the geostrategic partner in that sense. But it's in order for Canada to express this, do we have to combine or focus on one or the other in terms of, is it going to be diplomacy or is it going to be advocacy?
Well, let me pick up where Andrew left off, because sometimes in sports, the best defense is actually having a good offense. If you can run up the score, then you don't necessarily have to have the best defense. And we haven't really been playing offense in the U.S. in a long time, right? As I was mentioning before, the Australians are far more present in Washington's strategic community than Canada is. The Mexicans have 3 times as many consulates across the United States as we do. We don't show up, I think is a lot of the issue here. And it's Woody Allen who says that 90% of life is showing up. We need to show up more often. I think that you often hear from the Americans, and I think Chris can probably confirm this as well, that they don't see in Canada much strategic ambition for the bilateral relationship. So, rather than, purely playing defense and looking at this sort of from an administration to an administration perspective, what are the threats of the next 4 years going to be? And then what are the challenges of the 4 years after that going to be? I think, again, it goes back to thinking systemically about these things, just as we should think systemically about Canada's, interests in the world that are based on, fixed features or impersonal features. I shouldn't say fixed, but impersonal features like the balance of power, like geography. This is true as it relates to the United States as well. Let's look past any one administration and look at what's going on in the United States, because both the Democrats and the Republicans have protectionist impulses that are on the rise these days. It's not a one-party thing. It's a bipartisan issue. There are centrifugal political forces in the United States right now that are the result of political polarization that is being driven by both sides of the spectrum that could result in forms of instability that will not be without consequence for Canada. Indeed, we're already beginning to see this today. And when it comes to the way that both parties conceive of America's role in the world, I mean, we like to think that these are diametrically opposed, but they're diametrically opposed in rhetoric more than in actual substance, right? So yes, Donald Trump has been, has taken a sledgehammer to, American allies in ways that, previous US presidents would have considered to be impolitic. But, the reality is NATO survived, 4 years of Donald Trump. It will likely survive another 4 years of Donald Trump. As, Andrew was rightly saying, Trump is interested in what he can get out of a given relationship. And if that's a transactional approach, rather than using terms like unshakable, ironclad, sacrosanct as it relates to the US relationship with NATO, that's fine, but that doesn't mean that America won't be committed. America is in a strategic competition with China. It views Europe as an important player, a market, et cetera, in that competition that the US would like to have be a junior subservient partner. And for that reason, there will be a transaction in which basically, the United States agrees to continue, shouldering much of the load, maybe less and less, but much of the load of Europe's defense in exchange for Europe more or less doing, what the United States wants on the China file, maybe, getting to show some degree of independence so that, it can save face to some extent, right? So not a huge amount of difference, I see on that file. Both the Democrats and the Republicans are deeply committed at this point to the strategic competition with China. That even deepened under the Biden administration, because you saw smarter use of sanctions and technological restrictions under the Biden administration than you saw under the first Trump administration. A second Trump administration would inherit a lot of that, accumulated knowledge. You've seen the Biden administration be more prepared to use human rights logic and alliances, as tools against China. So in many ways, and of course, the Biden administration maintained this Indo-Pacific nomenclature, that first appeared under Donald Trump, right? So there's more continuity, between these administrations than there actually are differences. And so for all of those reasons, Russia as well, let's add Russia to the list. I mean, everyone likes to think that Donald Trump is Vladimir Putin's stooge or something. But if you actually look at, the policies that his first administration pursued, and who knows what's going to happen with respect to a potential Trump 2.0 administration's approach to Ukraine. If Trump is anything, he's unpredictable on that one front. And this is a file that he will inherit that he did not have in his first term, at least to the same extent. But nonetheless, if you look at the record of US-Russia relations under the Trump 1.0 administration, it was not a friendly relationship. It was a relationship that continued its drift towards the full-blown adversarial relationship that you see today. It was a relationship in which New START was not renewed, a relationship in which the INF Treaty fell apart, a relationship in which the United States committed itself to providing more military support, including lethal aid to the Ukrainians. An administration that was prepared to strike Russia's allies in Syria, et cetera. This was not a Russia-friendly administration by any stretch of the imagination. So again, more continuity there than difference. And so, I think we need to keep all of that in mind. Even the Democrats, when it comes to their emphasis on democracy versus autocracy, which is something that, Trump has not really embraced, that's also going to go by the wayside, right? Because the American strategic community is starting to realize that just does not play well with the rest of the world. And if Harris does win the election, you will see less emphasis on that, I would predict, under her 4 years in office. more emphasis maybe on ways in which to resurrect this so-called rules-based international order concept, which has admittedly struggled in recent years, especially since the start of the war in Gaza. Nonetheless, I think, again, this is another example of instances in which, the United States will maintain a path of relative continuity in its foreign policy. So Canada needs to keep all of that in mind. And therefore, rather than play defense from administration to administration, let's play offense. Let's think about what our interests are vis-a-vis the US. Let's develop a strategy to realize them, to communicate them, and to communicate them in the US strategic and intellectual community in Washington, like Chris is doing. We need more Chris Sands in Washington so that people in Washington can reflexively understand what Canada's strategic interests are and articulate them. There was just a parliamentary election in Georgia in the South Caucasus. And I bet you there are more people in Washington that are following that and that are interested in that than know the first thing about what's going on in Canadian politics. So just to give you a little bit of an example there.
Yeah. Thanks, Zach. Chris, I'll ask you one question, but in three components. It's daunting, but I think you're capable of answering it. I want to ask and direct, the challenges and opportunities that Canada can use or faces in either a Harris or a Trump 2.0 policies, Trump 2.0 presidency. We see currently that there is a Republican Party focused, on the economy. Immigration is a big one. In the Democratic ticket, we see concern with American democracy, maintaining America's alliance structure in Europe and the Indo-Pacific. But as Zach and Andrew, indicated, there is still the strong populist protectionist movement that's ingraining in both parties on trade. So are there any opportunities and challenges that Canada needs to consider or maybe embrace when it develops a new strategy for, this post-election presidency?
That's a very good question, even with three components. And thanks, Zach, for suggesting more of me would be an answer to anything. Can't imagine. Certainly would not win the vote in my own household, but there it is. Maybe the place I'll start is to try to reflect a little bit on what the U.S. has been going through recently. And the nature of the U.S. system is that we have our debates out in the open. We let it all hang out. You get to see our most sophisticated experts mixing it up with conspiracy theorists and people who are just having fun, jumping in and getting involved. And part of that raucous debate is a kind of dialogue between the public and our leadership about what kind of international role we're prepared to sustain. I think most Americans know that if we don't do it, nobody's going to do it for us in the big sense that we're, a great power, whether we like it or not, and we have certain responsibilities. But there are maybe three things that have been really important in that debate under the last couple of presidents. One is a debate about where globalization took us. And for many people, there has been a reaction that globalization has certainly benefited agile elites who figured out how to make money. There's no shortage of billionaires here in the US, and you see them all on TV. But there were a lot of people who felt that the strategy of competing with China and other markets was to lower costs as much as possible, and it needed offshore jobs. And there were communities that were hard hit. There were farmers who felt that it was harder and harder for them to compete producing food after the Green Revolution. They worried about their future. You're familiar with the broad outlines of that argument. And they found in the 2016 election, both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump saying to them, we should re-examine NAFTA. We should go and take a hard look at some of globalization, and we should try to put American interests first. We should care about how this affects people. And this current election that we're in here in the United States, the blue-collar worker has become the soccer mom of the cycle. It's the voter that everybody thinks is in play. And so the rhetoric is really focused on that. A second question is engagement. There is, I think, a fatigue among a lot of voters who are worried about our crumbling infrastructure, some of the things domestically that aren't working very well, the imminent, we're told, bankruptcy of Social Security and Medicare. And they see the world looking for the US ex machina to solve their problems too. And while the US can, I think there's some feeling that a focus on global issues comes as zero sum at the expense of American domestic priorities. That's not entirely fair, but it is a complaint that politicians, if they're worth their salt, have to respond to. And maybe the third, and I think this is the one that where Canada and the US are having slightly a different experience, and that's the impact of the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, during the war on terrorism. Um, for millennials and Generation Z, who are the largest part of our voting bloc, they grew up knowing families that had lost a soldier, or knew people in their community or town that were wounded veterans from those wars that are, trying to make pull their life together. It's a little different than the Vietnam War, but the feeling about the price of war is very human for a lot of our younger voters, and they don't like it. What Donald Trump brought us is a kind of return to an old idea that's popular, which is deterrence. We'll spend so much money that no one will dare take a poke at us, but we also won't have a lot of body bags coming home. It's maybe a strategy that the US has the luxury to pursue because we have the wealth to do it, but also we have a public support for it. Now, at the same time, all of that is going on, and I think is playing itself through, just as Andrew and Zach mentioned, in a sort of feeling of populism, as a feeling of wanting to shrug off burdens or whatnot, and alarming our friends in Ukraine and elsewhere. I think Canada's really missed this debate. Canadian leaders, because the Westminster system is so differently modeled, have interesting debates in cabinet about what to do. Your worst divisions, all of the concerns are really behind closed doors, even if Pierre Poilievre doesn't want to get a security clearance to have that conversation. But in that environment, the Canadian public looks and they see this vibrant debate in the US and they start thinking about it. And what do we get? Most Canadians now accept that 2% probably does make sense in a dangerous world. But that's a very mature conclusion. It's a sign of real strength in the Canadian public. But they came to that conclusion not because of Canadian leadership, but because they heard about it from the US and they thought, well, that's a reasonable request. That to me is one of the challenges of Canada. It lacks a conversation between leadership and public really about where Canada wants to go. And I have so much admiration for the Institute of Peace and Diplomacy in trying to contribute to that conversation and democratize it and give people a way to talk about where Canada wants to go. There's no doubt that we'll each make our own decisions and we'll have to reconcile how that all works out. But I think there is a hunger in Canada for kind of candor and honesty about the global role that Canada could or should play. And instead, what they've had, certainly in the last couple of years, is the Trudeau government really practicing domestic policy with one eye in a global mirror. Yes, it's perfectly normal to dress in what you think of as native costumes when you go to a festival for Diwali or something in Canada. But when you go to India, you don't dress up like it's Halloween. It was a mistake, but it was a mistake of a parochial leadership that wasn't thinking about what it was doing. Some of the smack talk that Justin Trudeau will levy at Xi Jinping when he can catch him in a corner at a summit probably plays better at home, certainly does not help Canadian interests vis-a-vis China or anywhere else. And I think that's an immaturity of the debate. Canadians shouldn't accept that as serious leadership, and they should demand better from whoever they choose to lead them. But I think that it is a reflection of a real problem. And as much as we're going to be a challenge for Canadians, I think to the extent to some extent, our real responsibility is to get our own houses in order and then meet and say, how can we work together? And I think neither of us is quite resolved where we want to be. And so we can't have that conversation at the maturity or the sophistication level we really should.
Thank you, Chris. Well, we have one more question here, and it's a question I didn't think we would have a chance to get to, but I'm kind of happy that we will get to it. And that relates to the dynamic between the Prime Minister and the President. Does having a strong, viable personal relationship as well as a professional one between the Prime Minister and the President create a better diplomatic environment to facilitate cooperation and manage dissenting opinions on important geopolitical policies that affect our bilateral relationship. Excuse me, throughout our relationship, throughout our our bilateral relationship, we've had prime ministers and presidents who have gone along fabulously well. One can think of Lester B. Pearson and JFK. We can think of Trudeau the Elder and Jimmy Carter. We can think of Brian Mulroney and Ronald Reagan. We can think of Trudeau with a short, very tenured with Barack Obama, but we've also had some low points, with Diefenbaker and JFK, with Trudeau the Elder and Reagan, and then obviously with Trudeau and Trump kind of having their kind of quarrels in terms of Trudeau talking behind Trump's back at the NATO summit, or Trump causing a disruption at Canada during Canada's hosting of the G7 back in 2018. So does this personal relationship between the Prime Minister and President, is it important for our two countries to get along and to progress on policies that are important for our relationship? And I'll direct this one to Chris first.
Sure. Well, I think the President and the Prime Minister are sort of the fire department of the relationship. They are where you go when things are on fire. And unfortunately, the world's on fire, so it would be good if they got along. I've been disappointed by, to some extent, the way in which during the Biden administration, Prime Minister Trudeau has labeled the opposition, MAGA light or connected to Trump, because it's a kind of diplomatic malpractice. In the short term, it may help win some arguments in Parliament. In the long term, it poisons the potential for a relationship between the Prime Minister and a re-elected Donald Trump, which at least is a non-zero possibility here. Having said that, there's always a road forward. That's what we learned from Amazing Grace. You can always find another way around. And I think that one of the things that Canadian leadership should think about is the long, slow introduction to the next administration. It takes a while. We're going to decide something in the United States next week. Hopefully the votes will be counted. I know it's going to probably take a long time before we're satisfied that we have a result. We'll have inauguration on January 20th. We have about 4,000 officials who have to get Senate confirmation. And because Mitch McConnell is retiring, we don't know how well the new Senate leadership will get along and how well they'll be able to work on that. So it could take a while to get cabinet, even longer to get ambassadors and other key positions confirmed, which makes that presidential prime ministerial relationship very important. And we have a couple of things, a couple of occasions that we know are coming where the prime minister and presidents can actually work together. So there'll be a G20 summit in Brazil towards the end of November. We have a APEC summit in Peru, which Canada and the U.S. attend. That's a second opportunity. Those will be with the Biden team. But as we look forward, you'll see Canada's hosting the G7 in June. At the end of June, Netherlands is hosting the NATO summit. There'll also be some opportunities for us to talk about the North American Leaders Summit. That was what I was trying to remember. We are supposed to have had one in 2023 hosted by Canada. Mexico hosted that year. Canada's been trying to find a date to host the next one. And we will inevitably have to have one in 2025 to tee up the USMCA or CUSMA review process. So there'll be a North American leaders meeting as well. Those are opportunities for face-to-face time, and each of them has a set of ministerials around it so that cabinet ministers can meet their counterparts. Canada's never stronger than in those personal relationships because of the cultural rapport and the easy, usual relationship despite the asymmetries of power. So I would be prepared to get to know the neighbors, to rely a little bit more heavily on the presidential prime ministerial connection to the extent you can, and cabinet to cabinet as well, until you have more people in place and you can begin to let the bureaucracy, the machinery of diplomacy then kick in and help the ship to right itself. It's going to be a difficult time because everyone will be trying to have those relationships. But just as a last thought, and I don't want to filibuster here, but Jeremy Shapiro, great American diplomat now with the German Marshall Fund, wrote a fascinating piece in the Financial Times last March, I guess, where he talked about the problem with the Biden administration being that Europeans kept getting rolled. They were so weak they couldn't say no to the Americans. And when they woke up in the morning, they found out that the Americans had done something. They objected that there'd been no consultation. It couldn't happen. They talked to the American ambassador. The American ambassador said, yeah, it's done. That's a reflection of a Washington which is very tightly divided in a partisan way, and there's a lot of polarization. So all the really meaningful conversations are held in Washington as they try to get that one bill to get passed, that one decision to be made. Everything happens here very close and very face to face. Europe may feel that it can't win those fights. It certainly can't when it comes in at the end. What Canada's diplomacy has shown, and I know we've been picking on weaknesses in Canada's diplomacy, but Canada's game in Washington is outstanding. And there isn't a day, I think, in the congressional calendar when there are members in town that the ambassador and key people are not meeting with members of Congress, members of the Senate, not having conversations with the staff, not working with people in the administration, sitting down with cabinet ministers, even reaching out to governors around the country. Canada works very hard at the U.S. relationship, and therefore it's not surprised. And Ambassador Cohen, who's a very nice, very competent, I think outstanding ambassador the U.S. has in Ottawa, once said that he found that Canadians had an annoying habit of whining and throwing hissy fits over nothing, including that his example was the Inflation Reduction Act subsidies for purchases of electric vehicles, which one member of Congress suggested should be for 100% US made cars only. And Canada went to work. And for months, no one heard anything but that. It was mentioned in every speech, constantly went on. And Ambassador Cohen said, in the end, it never was in the legislation. It never happened. Canada made a fuss over nothing. I would say no. It was never in the legislation because Canada made a fuss over it, and that was a win for Canada. But I'm not sure Canadians appreciate that. But you're very, very good at this part of your international relationship, and I want you to be good at everything.
Thank you, Chris. Andrew, you have the difficulty of following that eloquent answer by Christopher.
Well, it's difficult to follow in terms of the specifics, but I will say this in terms of a frame. I think it's a dialectic. I think there are deep structural things at play here, which no politician can negotiate out of. Sometimes Canada and the US share interests. Sometimes our interests diverge, and that's a deep structural thing. On the other hand, the other part of the dialectic is that interpersonal relationships matter enormously, whether it's president to prime minister or whether it's just the hard work that Chris just talked about in terms of Canadian diplomats and others working their networks to make sure that bad things don't happen to Canada. And I think we can put both of those things together. I personally don't believe that just because a prime minister and a president like each other and can have a chat and a cup of coffee, that's going to change the relationship fundamentally. But I do think this, if that relationship is bad, the structural issues, right, the incompatibility of national interests are going to be much harder to smooth over and to reconcile. So I'm inclined as a political scientist to look at this as, yep, America has national interest, Canada has national interests. Sometimes they coincide, sometimes they conflict. And what's the grease that kind of, to mix metaphors, to smooth that over a little bit? And it is that interpersonal relationship, and not just the interpersonal relationship at the very top level, but Canadian diplomats in Washington and in state capitals, right? Working their networks day in and day out to make good things happen and prevent bad things from happening from a Canadian perspective. And I've no doubt that the reciprocal is true as well, that there are American diplomats in Ottawa and the various provincial capitals also work in their interests, right? So I like to think of it as both and, not either or.
Thank you, Andrew. Zachary, we'll give you the last word of the panel, and just you've hinted at it before, but is this relationship and between the prime minister and the president, if it is going to be negative or if it's going to be positive, at the end of the day, can Canada use it to advance its own interests, or is it going to be a speed bump in the relationship for us to really advance our own national interests going forward?
I mean, if we take the example of another bilateral relationship, let's look for a second at the U.S.-Russia relationship, which has required a tremendous amount of chemistry between the two presidents in order to get things done. Situations like that tend to emerge when the relationship is not particularly institutionalized at lower levels. And Canada and the United States are fortunate not to have a situation like that in which we have a more significantly institutionalized relationship. The U.S.-Russia relationship on the economic side, is very small comparatively speaking. It's a narrow set of issues, that have been traditionally on the table for the past several decades. It's very different from the type of relationship that Canada and the United States have managed to forge over the course of several decades. And so, in that sense, I'm inclined, to appreciate the metaphor that Chris put forward, that we're dealing effectively with firefighters when we're dealing with the people at the top. If you have a deeply institutionalized relationship, it's one that should be able to be managed, on a more consistent basis. What worries me, and this is perhaps it goes somewhat against what I was suggesting before, in that there will be, if Donald Trump is elected on Tuesday, a significant consideration pertaining to who the Prime Minister of Canada is going to be when the government in Ottawa does fall, and how that will affect Canada's ability to advance its interests. I think, as you mentioned yourself, Andrew, there's no love lost, it seems, between Justin Trudeau and Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump has made his views on our Prime Minister quite clear. And there's little doubt in my mind that if Trump is reelected, that Justin Trudeau will use that to his advantage electorally, domestically within Canada, basically to the effect of saying something along the lines of, we can't afford to have a Trump 2.0 in Canada. And there's no question that risks, poisoning a relationship, not just with, half the country, which remains aligned with Donald Trump, despite everything he's done and said. But the fact is that Donald Trump is someone who seems to act alone outside the confines of traditional U.S. institutional politics more than the average president. There's sort of what Donald Trump wants and does and says, and then there's sort of the official policy of the administration. And that might be different under Trump 2.0. He might get a lot more people in there, advisors who are more aligned with his actual goals this time around, rather than the so-called adults in the room strategy that we saw after 2016. But nonetheless, that unpredictability, that impulsiveness is still going to be there. And so, that's something I think we also need to keep in mind, that while we do need to look long-term at what Canada's national interests are, make sure we're communicating them, we're pursuing them. Let's not forget that if Donald Trump is reelected here, that the specific dynamic between our Prime Minister and their president is going to be something that needs to be very carefully managed. And that's something that our current Prime Minister in particular needs to take into account if he wants to pursue Canada's national interests effectively. However loathsome he may find Donald Trump, and however much that might require us to some extent to tone down certain other aspects of our international rhetoric, not just our domestic rhetoric, appealing to progressive forces, but also acknowledging that if Donald Trump is reelected, a lot of our international rhetoric may start to come across a little bit more hypocritical as well. And how much does Canada need to adjust its posture and its vocabulary surrounding the so-called rules-based international order, which is important in the abstract and important certainly in terms of the type of bare minimum rules that we need in order to pursue our basic interests in the world, but is different from how many Western elites have conceived that concept, which tends to put a very West-centric, liberal-centric foreign policy at the core, in which we presume, although we presume to be defending a neutral international order, we are appointing ourselves effectively the arbiters of that order. And that may be untenable if Donald Trump is reelected. I think the rest of the world will basically see that this rules-based international order concept is totally hypocritical, that the U.S. does whatever it wants to advance its interests, And if Canada keeps beating on that drum and does not adopt a more empathetic tone vis-a-vis much of the rest of the world, that could undercut our foreign policy interests in the rest of the world as well. So that's something I think we should give some thought to.
Well, gentlemen, this was an absolute pleasure, especially on the lead up right on the cusp of the election. So I thank you for coming on today. There are so many items that, I think that we hit that the audience has a lot to take away from and to help them understand what's going on in the States, but also what's going on bilaterally in our relationship as well. And as, events unfold with election day on Tuesday, I think we'll have a lot more to say about it and really bring in items that we didn't have a chance to discuss today, like whether or not it will be a united government behind one political party and one candidate, or is it going to be a divided government, and the role of provinces. We've hinted at it, very briefly here. What role does the provinces have in, pursuing and helping advance Canada's interests with their federal counterparts, but also within the state legislators, state governors, and, municipalities. So, I want to thank you guys very much for providing your insights and your opinions, and it will definitely go a long way for any results that happen on Tuesday. I also would like to extend my gratitude to the audience for joining us this evening, especially on Halloween, and for providing questions. Chris, I saw that you commented on one in the comment section, so that's great. And then lastly, I would just like to inform everyone that this webinar will be recorded and then also published on IPD's website. I encourage everyone to subscribe to IPD's newsletter and to follow IPD on social media for updates on future roundtables. So, yeah, again, gentlemen, thank you so much for making time tonight, and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.